Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one. An unidentified man shackled to a pickaxe, showing a typical punishment faced by black individuals living under these conditions in the early 1930s. This type of punishment reflects the severe inequalities and abuses still present in post-slavery American society, especially in the forced labor system. Enslaved children working on farms in southeastern Missouri in 1938. Even after the abolition of slavery, child labor was still common in rural areas of the southern United States. Children were often responsible for exhausting agricultural tasks in a system that perpetuated inequality and exploitation. The photograph documents the condition of Gordon, a former enslaved man who, after escaping from a plantation in the southern United States, was photographed to highlight the scars left by the abuses he suffered. His image became a symbol of the brutality of slavery and was widely circulated during the fight for abolition. Enslaved individuals carrying their masters in Madagascar, reflecting the brutal practice that existed in various parts of the world. In the 19th century, slavery was prevalent in many African colonies, with Africans being forced to work under extreme conditions for the benefit of their owners, with no freedom. A photograph of a slave auction held in a public space in Lexington, Kentucky in 1840. The crowd, mostly men wearing suits and hats, watches as the auctioneer, standing on a cart, conducts the sale. The auction took place in Cheapside, the largest slave market in the state, a sad reflection of the brutality of the human trafficking trade at the time. Around 1900, black men imprisoned at Mala Prison in Malawi were forced to sleep as slaves slept on a slave ship. These inhumane conditions reflected the brutality of the prison system, where prisoners were treated disrespectfully and deprived of dignity, in a situation reminiscent of slavery. Jokie Doy, a condemned enslaved liberator, was rescued by this group from the St. Joseph Prison in Missouri in 1859. His action reflects resistance to the slave system in the United States, with people willing to risk their own lives to help free enslaved individuals and fight racial injustice at the time. A black woman carries a white child on her back in Bahia, Brazil in 1860. This scene illustrates the complex social dynamics of the time, where black women, often enslaved, were forced to care for the children of their masters, while their own families suffered from forced separation. A lady with two enslaved individuals in Bahia in 1860. The scene illustrates the social division of the time, where black men, often enslaved, were responsible for various domestic and field tasks, while their mistresses enjoyed a life of privilege over others. Harriet Tubman, American abolitionist, on the far left, holding a pot, photographed with a group of enslaved individuals she helped escape during the Civil War. Tubman, known as the Moses of the Black People, was one of the key figures in the Underground Railroad, rescuing hundreds of enslaved individuals and leading the fight for freedom and civil rights. Children on a sugar plantation in Louisiana, around 1885. Even after the abolition of slavery, many of these children continued to work on the plantations, performing heavy tasks under severe conditions. Their childhood was stolen, and forced labor continued to be a reality for many African American families in the southern United States. A family of enslaved individuals at Dr. William Gaines's farm in Hanover County, Virginia, in 1862. The expressions of sadness and suffering on the faces of this family reflect the pain of living under a system that stripped them of their freedom. The empty gaze, marked by exhaustion and oppression, told the story of generations without a voice but full of silent resistance. Enslaved children working in the fields in 1903. These children were often African American and part of a forced labor system that persisted after the abolition of slavery. They were treated as cheap labor, subjected to extremely harsh conditions and deprived of basic rights. A family of African American enslaved individuals works in a field in Georgia in 1850. Forced to perform agricultural labor on plantations, they faced brutal conditions and were deprived of their freedom, while the slave system still dominated the southern United States. Enslaved individuals, former enslaved individuals, and children of enslaved individuals work in a cotton field in South Carolina between 1860 and 1900. During this period, cotton cultivation was one of the major industries in the southern United States, and black communities continued to play a crucial role in the region's agricultural economy. A group of African Americans aboard the USS Vermont. The United States Navy employed thousands of formerly enslaved individuals during the Civil War, offering them an opportunity to fight for freedom and civil rights. These men played crucial roles, both as sailors and as support workers, contributing to the Union's victory. The Abolition of Slavery by Princess Isabel, recorded in the 19th century photography collection of Gilberto Ferrez in 1888. The image is a historical landmark symbolizing the end of slavery in Brazil, when Princess Isabel signed the Golden Law, freeing millions of Africans and their descendants, ending over 300 years of exploitation. Ezra Greenleaf Weld at the Fugitive Slave Law Convention of 1850 in Cazenovia, New York, on August 21st and 22nd of 1850. The convention marked a milestone in the fight against the fugitive slave law, which required the capture of former enslaved individuals, even in free states. The first photographs of labor inside a gold mine in Minas Gerais, Brazil, in 1888. They reveal the harsh conditions faced by workers who extracted gold from the mines, one of Brazil's main sources of wealth in the 19th century, marked by exploitation and heavy oppression, especially through abusive taxes. Enslaved individuals working together on the plantations of the Vale do Paraíba, Brazil, around 1882. Entire families were forced to perform exhausting work on the plantations, often separated from their relatives, but also creating bonds of solidarity among themselves. This unity was a form of resistance, where families sought to preserve their humanity. Brazilian enslaved individuals practicing capoeira, created as a form of disguised resistance, combining fighting movements and dance, allowing the enslaved to defend themselves and preserve their culture. Initially banned, capoeira became a symbol of freedom, resistance, and cultural identity. Cotton pickers, men, women, and children, walking in a line at the Alexander Knox Plantation near Charleston, South Carolina, around 1865. Cotton was one of the main commodities of the southern United States, essential for the economy and responsible for sustaining the global textile industry. A group of enslaved individuals outside their cabins on a plantation on Cockspur Island, Georgia. The cabins were small, poorly constructed, and often housed several families under the same roof in unhealthy and cramped conditions. Overcrowding and lack of resources made life extremely difficult, with families facing disease and hunger. Enslaved individuals draining rice fields at Mulberry Plantation in South Carolina. The arduous task of draining the fields was part of the forced labor on plantations, essential for rice production, one of the southern United States' greatest riches. These workers faced inhumane conditions, being forced to work without rest in a system that stripped them of their dignity and freedom. Slave traders Birch and Colrers in Alexandria, Virginia, in 1862. This image illustrates the operation of one of the largest names in the slave trade at the time, who profited from selling enslaved individuals, a cruel trade that continued to be a central part of the economy in the southern United States. In Zanzibar, enslaved individuals in chains are watched by a soldier. During the 19th century, Zanzibar was one of the main centers of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean, and slavery remained a common practice until its abolition in 1897, when the island was heavily influenced by British presence. Around 1930, forced labor in Liberia was a common practice, especially in cargo handling. Many workers, including African Americans and indigenous people, were forced to endure exhausting work under harsh conditions. This system persisted despite efforts to eradicate labor exploitation in Africa. Ambrose Douglas, a former enslaved African American, was photographed with some of his 38 children and grandchildren on the Lewis Resin Plantation, around 1939 in Brooksville, Florida. His life symbolized resistance and family reconstruction after the abolition of slavery in a context of profound adversities. A portrait of a Bedouin slave trader in Saudi Arabia, around 1935. The photograph reflects a period when the slave trade was still practiced in some parts of the Arab world, with the Bedouins, traditional nomads of the region, involved in the trade of people, especially children and women, for forced labor. A photograph titled, "These Are the Generations of Ham," from 1895. The image depicts a scene that refers to old racist narratives associating African Americans with the descendants of Ham, a distorted interpretation of the Bible used to justify slavery. This stereotype had a lasting impact on racial perception in American society. A nanny with her master's child, photographed in 1870 in Bahia, Brazil. The image reflects the complex dynamics between enslaved black women and their masters' families, who were often responsible for caring for the master children, while their own families suffered from slavery conditions and forced separation. In Bartow County, state prisoners rest in their dormitories after a day's work. This practice was tied to the forced labor system in the early 20th century, where prisoners, many of whom were African American, were employed in public tasks and still faced harsh conditions. Prisoners working on the construction of streets in Birmingham in 1909. During this period, the city was undergoing rapid industrialization, and forced labor, especially of African Americans, became a means to supply cheap labor for public works and local infrastructure. These prisoners were transported in a special wagon known for transporting convicted men, many of whom were African American. These prisoners were taken to work under severe conditions, being used in infrastructure projects like street and railroad construction within the forced labor system of the time. Olaudah Equiano, one of the leading British abolitionists, played a crucial role in the movement for the abolition of slavery. His autobiography, which detailed his experiences as an enslaved person, was pivotal in raising public awareness and influencing public opinion, driving the fight against the slave trade. Enslaved individuals working on a coffee plantation in São Paulo, around 1882. Coffee was one of Brazil's main sources of wealth in the 19th century, and enslaved labor was crucial to sustaining this economy. Slavery in Brazil would only be abolished in 1888 with the signing of the Golden Law. Isaac and Rosa, enslaved children from New Orleans around 1863, grew up in an environment of oppression and abuse. During the Civil War, many young people like them were forced to work on southern plantations without freedom, living under constant threats of separation from their families. A black woman enslaved, churning butter in a large colonial kitchen in the mid-19th century. The image evokes the harsh working conditions on plantations, where enslaved individuals, even enslaved children, were responsible for domestic tasks, often invisible but essential for the functioning of their masters' homes. Frederick Douglass, between 1855 and 1865, was one of the most influential figures in the abolitionist movement in the United States. A former enslaved man, he became an eloquent advocate for freedom, using his autobiography and powerful speeches to fight against slavery and racial oppression, gaining national recognition. Born into slavery, the American writer and abolitionist bought his freedom with the earnings from lecturing abroad after the publication of his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. His work and speeches played a crucial role in the fight against slavery and the promotion of civil rights for African Americans. A photograph titled Hoeing Rice from South Carolina, USA, around 1904. Rice cultivation was essential to the economy of the southern United States, with many African American workers, descendants of former enslaved individuals, ensuring the production under difficult conditions. Rice plantations became an agricultural pillar for domestic supply and trade. A lithograph depicting a clergyman presiding over the marriage of two enslaved individuals belonging to a wealthy family in Brazil in 1839. The work was created by Thierry Frere from a painting by Jean-Baptiste Debray. This image illustrates the complex reality of slavery in Brazil, where, despite the lack of freedom, marriage ceremonies were performed, but with continuous control by the masters over the lives of the enslaved. Hilliard Taylor, wearing a bank messenger uniform in Boston, Massachusetts, around 1925. Taylor, about 80 years old at the time, was born into slavery in Orange County, Virginia, and was owned by Colonel Patton of the Confederate Army. His life illustrated the journey of resistance and overcoming, from slavery to achieving an active role in post-abolition society. A row of enslaved cabins in Chatham County photographed in 1934. Although slavery imposed inhumane conditions, enslaved people formed families and communities within and around their homes, creating bonds of support and resistance in the face of oppression, preserving their humanity in extreme circumstances. A group of former enslaved individuals gathering at the former plantation of Confederate General Thomas Drayton. After the plantation was occupied by Union troops, these former enslaved individuals began to harvest and process cotton for their own profit, marking a moment of independence and resistance amid the Civil War. A sketch of African enslaved individuals carrying water on their heads, dated to 1835. The image reflects the harsh conditions faced by enslaved Africans, often forced to perform heavy and exhausting tasks like carrying water, in a society that stripped them of their dignity and freedom. A group of former enslaved African Americans along a dock during the U.S. Civil War. With the arrival of Union troops and the fight for freedom, many former enslaved individuals found work opportunities and autonomy, marking a moment of transition and resistance during the conflict. Lucindy Lawrence Jordan, a former enslaved woman aged 79 in Alabama, USA in 1936. She was interviewed by the Federal Writers Project as part of the narratives of enslaved individuals documented by the U.S. Work Projects Administration. Her story is a testament to resistance and the struggle for freedom in a time marked by inequality. Departure for the coffee harvest in an ox-drawn cart in the Vale do Paraíba, Brazil, around 1885. Coffee cultivation powered the Brazilian economy, and the enslaved workforce was crucial to production. The journey, marked by exhaustion and exploitation, reflected the ongoing racial inequality of the time. Black workers performing the Candago dance in 1993. The dance, part of African traditions preserved in Brazil, was often performed by enslaved individuals and their descendants as a form of cultural resistance, keeping their roots alive and creating a unique identity in a context of intense oppression. Enslaved individuals working in the coffee harvest in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, around 1882. Under the weight of the slave system, many were forced to perform the task without any reward. However, the daily struggle and community life on the plantations created a sense of community and resistance among those who shared the pain and hope of freedom. A family of former enslaved individuals outside their makeshift home in Fredericksburg, Virginia, around 1862. After the abolition of slavery, many African Americans faced extreme poverty and a lack of support, struggling to rebuild their lives in a country still marked by racial inequality. Students and teachers pose outside the Freedmen's Bureau School in Beaufort, South Carolina. After the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau Agency was created to assist the formerly enslaved, offering education and legal assistance. The school symbolizes the struggle for education and empowerment of the African American community during a period of Reconstruction and the search for equality. A group of enslaved women and children sitting and standing around the door of a rustic wooden cabin in the southern United States, mid-19th century. A woman reads a book to a group of seated children, offering a rare moment of learning and resistance in an environment where education was often prohibited for the enslaved. Prisoners and guards taking a break from work in Atlanta in 1895. The prison system at the time still used forced labor, a practice that continued even after the abolition of slavery in the United States in 1865. prisoners from a forced labor prison working in a well in Macon, Georgia around 1900. This practice, common in the penal system of the time, was a continuation of injustices that arose after the abolition of slavery, with many former enslaved individuals still being forced to work. A rare photo found in the attic of a house in North Carolina shows 2 enslaved children. In April 2010, the photo was discovered at a yard sale in Charlotte, North Carolina, accompanied by a document detailing the sale of these 2 children for $1,150 in 1854. Around 1928, a group of anti-slavery activists gathered in Hull City. During this period, the abolitionist movement continued to fight against the consequences of slavery and promote equal rights, highlighting the struggle for social justice and equality, even after the official end of slavery. Sir Thomas Buxton, Vice President of the Anti-Slavery Society from 1895 to 1899, was a key figure in the fight against slavery in the United Kingdom. His tireless work helped promote the abolition of the slave trade and secure more rights for African descendants, leaving a legacy of social justice. Tony Thompson, born into slavery, grew up in Greene County, Georgia. Son of enslaved parents, he spent his childhood on a plantation before the abolition of slavery. After gaining his freedom, Thompson faced the challenges of a society marked by segregation, fighting for his dignity and rights. Henry Brooks was born enslaved in the mid-19th century. He grew up in an exploitative system in the southern United States, where forced labor was the norm. His life and experience reflect the brutal conditions faced by millions of African Americans during the era of slavery before its abolition. Enslaved individuals working on the coffee farm in the Vale do Paraíba, São Paulo, Brazil, in 1882. Coffee was one of Brazil's main sources of wealth, which kept slavery intact until 1888, being the last country in the Americas to abolish this brutal practice. Work on coffee plantations was intense and inhumane. A photograph from 1875 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, shows street vendors known as quitandeiras, also called slaves who earn. Part of the profits from selling food on the streets was sent to their masters, reflecting the ongoing exploitation of enslaved women. Enslaved individuals working in the homes of masters in Salvador, Brazil, in 1870. They were responsible for household tasks such as cleaning, cooking, and taking care of the master's children. Though more protected from the brutality of agricultural work, their lives were marked by constant surveillance and separation from their families. The marriage certificate with tintypes of Augustus L. Johnson and Melinda Murphy, dated July 9, 1874, documents the union of 2 individuals in a period of great social transformation in the United States. After the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, marriages like that of Augustus and Melinda represented a new phase of freedom and civil rights for African Americans. A tintype of James Washington, late 19th century. Tintypes were a popular photography format of the time, often used to depict ordinary people. This tintype of James Washington reflects the experience of many blacks in the post-abolition era, when civil rights were still being fought for in a society marked by deep inequalities. Portrait of African American residents in an early settlement in the Nicodemus area of Graham County, Kansas, in the late 19th century. Nicodemus was a thriving colony in the Midwest of the United States, which attracted former enslaved individuals seeking new opportunities and freedom. The settlement became a symbol of resistance and the quest for autonomy in the post-abolition era. A black mother poses with her children on the grounds of the Flanagan property in 1954 in Nashville, Tennessee. This photo reflects the daily struggle for dignity and family life within a society still marked by racial segregation, where many black families, despite difficulties, sought to build their communities and maintain their traditions. A portrait of Mark Thrash, a resident of Chickamauga Park, Tennessee, in 1939. Thrash claimed to have been born on December 25, 1820, which would make him 118 years old at the time this photograph was taken. Born into slavery, his parents were from Africa, and his story symbolizes the resistance and preservation of the memory of former enslaved individuals. A black woman enslaved at the Owens Thomas House and Slave Quarters in Savannah, Georgia, in 1985. A historical and reflective representation of the life of enslaved individuals who lived and worked on the property, with the house serving as an important memory site, preserving the history of slavery in the southern United States. Sugarcane cutters in Jamaica, during the post-abolition period, worked on plantations under exhausting conditions. Many of them were descendants of enslaved individuals, facing long working hours and low wages. Sugarcane continued to be one of the country's main crops, with black labor being essential to the agricultural industry. An engraving depicting men, women, and children, all African American, gathered around a man with a watch, awaiting the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Dated to the 19th century, the image symbolizes the anxious wait for freedom, as the nation prepared to abolish slavery in the United States, marking a historical milestone in civil rights. Booker T. Washington, in 1887, was a central figure in the fight for African American rights during the late 19th century. Founder of the Tuskegee Institute, Washington promoted education and self-determination as pathways to social and economic advancement for black people, facing challenges imposed by segregation and racial discrimination. Robert de Baptiste was a name associated with the fight for civil rights for African Americans during the late 19th century. Although details about his life are limited, he is part of an era of growing resistance to racial oppression when the black community began to organize for equality and social justice in the United States. Newell Houston Ensley was a relevant name during a crucial period for the African American population after the abolition of slavery. His contribution, though poorly documented, reflects the complex struggles and achievements of black communities in the pursuit of education, equality, and full participation in post-Civil War American society. Just like their enslaved ancestors, women on Sapelo Island pounded rice with a pestle around 1925. The cultural and linguistic traditions of West Africa were preserved in the Geechee culture, which developed on the Sea Islands, keeping alive practices and knowledge passed down through generations. The famous engraving by Thomas Nast was originally published in Harper's Weekly in January of 1863. The liberation of the enslaved population of the state, which numbered over 400,000 people, began in the chaos of the Civil War and continued until 1865. Nast's drawing aimed to evoke sympathy for the formerly enslaved after emancipation. On the farms of Rio de Janeiro, such as Fazenda da Cachoeira, in 1892, enslaved individuals were forced to work in the coffee plantations, enduring exhausting days in the drying yard. These large estates were not just agricultural production sites, but also spaces of brutality, where the workers' lives were controlled to ensure the owner's profit. Those responsible for the care at Magnolia on the Ashley, also known as Magnolia Gardens, in Charleston, South Carolina, around 1900. Many of the workers were former enslaved individuals or their descendants, who continued performing maintenance tasks on the plantations, facing difficult conditions in a deeply segregated society. Emancipated enslaved individuals brought from Louisiana by Colonel George H. Banks in December of 1863. During the Civil War, many enslaved individuals sought freedom by joining Union troops. The emancipation movement brought new opportunities but also challenges as the former enslaved individuals faced an uncertain future. Enslaved individuals working in the sweet potato fields at the Hopkinson Plantation, South Carolina, around 1862. The plantation was one of many that relied on enslaved labor to sustain agricultural production. These workers were forced to endure long hours under severe conditions while landowners amassed wealth at their expense. An enslaved black family with a woman holding a small child stands in the doorway of their plantation home on Fort George Island, Florida, circa 1875. Later known as Kingsley Plantation, After one of the site's early owners, the plantation originally covered 1,000 acres and relied heavily on enslaved labor. A group of young children sitting on the floor while women rest next to a door, and a man tends to an ox-drawn cart in a scene of enslaved workers outside their homes at the end of the day on a plantation in South Carolina in 1860. The scene reflects the exhaustion and routine imposed on the enslaved, with few moments of rest or dignity. A former enslaved individual working on a tobacco field at West Sington Plantation, Tennessee in 1880. The plantation, one of the largest in the region, depended on forced labor from men, women, and children who were responsible for cultivating tobacco, one of the most lucrative products in the southern United States, under extremely harsh conditions. Chinese women victims of child slavery in a documented case. In the 19th century, many Chinese women and children were forced to work under extreme conditions in different parts of the world, especially on plantations and in factories, in an exploitative system that deprived them of freedom and dignity. Enslaved individuals at Casina Point Plantation, James Hopkinson's property on Edisto Island, South Carolina, begin their workdays at the earliest hours of the morning. Before dawn, they were already in the fields, facing long and exhausting hours of work. The routine was marked by a lack of rest and constant oppression, with a little time for family bonds or personal care. A group of Gullah Geechee people alongside a rice raft near Georgetown, South Carolina, in 1904. The Gullah Geechee community, descended from enslaved Africans, preserved their language and cultural traditions over the years. Fishing and rice cultivation were essential practices for the survival and identity of this community, keeping their African heritage alive even after the abolition of slavery. A group of enslaved individuals and a white woman outside the Florida Club in St. Augustine, Florida. The scene reflects the complex social dynamics of the time, where racial segregation and black oppression were evident, with the enslaved being treated as property, even while interacting with the members of the society's ruling class. Abache and Cudjoe Kazula Lewis, two survivors of the Clotilda slave ship, represent the last known victims of the transatlantic slave trade who arrived in the United States. Cudjoe, who was around 19 years old at the time of arrival in 1860, was brought illegally to Alabama and later became a central figure in the African American community of Africatown.